morning again.
Good morning.
And let's get started on this September 11th, 2019. And I'm sure we all remember where we were 18 years ago this morning. The day that changed the world for us. Wow. So we are in our study, continuing our study in the Gospel of John. And we're now in a very familiar portion of the book of the interaction with Nicodemus, Jesus and Nicodemus, out of John chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. So I'm going to make a few introductory comments, and if somebody could be ready to read the interchange between Jesus and Nicodemus is really about 21 verses long, but if somebody could just read the first 9 verses in just a moment when I finish up here. So by way of review, last time we were together, we looked at, that was the first week we looked at this. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, initiating a dialogue in a respectful and affirming manner. Teacher, we know that you are such and such. He comes representing the Pharisaical community. He states to Jesus that they as a group believe that he fits within their framework of thinking as one who is a teacher from God. That's a direct quote. We know that you are from God. The term teacher affirms Jesus' ability to communicate a cohesive message. The phrase from God most likely is affirming him as one who speaks on behalf of God. Their endorsement of him is based on actions he has performed, signs, leading them to their logical conclusion that, quote, and it's a quote, God is with him. Okay, that's where we looked at last week. And then continue. However, what begins as a warm invitation for dialogue, Jesus abruptly turns into a teaching regarding the necessity for a new birth. John, the writer, uses the Greek term anothen to describe this new birth, that term. What follows is a disconnect within this exchange. Nicodemus has difficulty grasping what Jesus is attempting to communicate, and he narrows his focus, that's Nicodemus, narrows his focus to the physical birth process. How can a man climb back into his mother's womb and be born? You know, he's on tilt. So that's where we left it last week. So if someone could now just refresh us in the entire exchange there, or at least this portion, somebody could read verses 1 through 9.
Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher who has come from God. For no one can perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with them. In reply, Jesus declared, I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. How can a man be born when he is old? Nicodemus answered. Surely he cannot enter a second time into his mother's womb to be born. Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he is born of water and of the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. How can this be, Nicodemus asked.
Okay, yeah, that's the end of verse 9. Yeah, how can these things be? Yep. Okay, so, all right, thanks, Bill. So, why this disconnect? 2 times within this text, Nicodemus is attempting to respond back to Jesus, and both times are clearly stating some level of confusion. He's not getting what Jesus is trying to say. So why is this disconnect taking place? Well, I'd like to rewind and go back to several weeks ago when we looked at, as we introduced during the prologue section, these 3 symbols. And these 3 symbols are really the backdrop and symbolize the problem of the jungle, which is the backdrop of this screen. You see, I don't know from where you are, but you see a bunch of little arrows. And they represent 3 human propensities demonstrating separateness. And we got this out of our brief look at Genesis chapter 3 and then moving into chapter 4. And I think those two chapters not only tell a story of what happened, but they depict an imprint of what will occur for the entire human condition from that point on. And I think there are 3. There could be more, but at least from Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel, we see 3 human propensities, outcomes of what occurred in chapter 3. That's how I'm looking at it. So, the first set of arrows here represent, and this is seen in Genesis chapter 4, this human propensity for comparison. And it's just prevalent within all of our condition, and it's like obvious. We tend to compare ourselves either and place ourselves in relation to others and through a comparative process, and that leads to all kind of degrading kind of problems. The second human propensity is resistance, and that's depicted by the double bar and the arrow trying to get through, that we get blockages. When something out of the ordinary, something outside of our grid of understanding tries to enter into our lives, our tendency as human beings is to resist that. And so there is the second. And again, all 3 of these are seen in Genesis chapter 4. The third one is domination. And of course the arrow pushing down, finding myself in a position of power, I will tend to suppress whatever, to dominate, to control, and that is the third propensity. Comparison, resistance, and domination. And I took these and reduced them down and just said these are the 3 that depict this human problem that we have that's universal, and I'm calling it the jungle. Jesus is now in the jungle, and we're watching the Word incarnate interact within that jungle. So the jungle is present in this dialogue. So in the story itself, all 3 of those represent are part of this human condition that I'm calling separateness. So in our story, I think we are seeing Nicodemus depicting this human propensity of resistance. I don't think Nicodemus is struggling with his intelligence. I think it is a resistance. He's got a category for how things are. He sees how things are, and Jesus is speaking outside of his grid, and he's having a hard time receiving that. And so that's my my interpretation of what's going on. And so this, if that's true, this is how this situation works. Resistance works like this. And this is one, in the story itself. I'm depicting Nicodemus's understanding of birth, this word anoten, as an image. He's got this imprinted in his head. Think of Nicodemus plotting this on his organizational shelf on everything he knows, and on his shelf in his head, birth looks like this. This is what birth is. And he's bound and determined, this is the way it is. This is the way it is. Okay, so then Jesus comes on the scene, and he's saying what birth is. It's on tilt. It's cockeyed. It's, yes, it includes that, but let's look at it from a little bit different perspective. In this case, 90 degrees out of tilt. Okay, so Nicodemus, as Jesus is giving him that information, did you see the box trying to penetrate into the grid? Nicodemus is pushing it away. He put, no, there's no way, and that symbol that I'm using there depicts that process. He's, no way, it's like water being shed off of a duck's back, if you will. He says, no way, and that is the problem. He cannot receive what Jesus is saying. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, kind of yes and no, but he didn't turn around and walk away. He asked the question, how? So he's still inquiring. And he's resisting this, but he's not fleeing the scene.
Okay. Yes, and that's what's so interesting about this, and I want to leave the remainder of our time this morning. We've got plenty of time. I think I've introduced the idea of resistance. And now what I would like for us to do at our tables is what is to describe, but you've already started our discussion. What barriers do you think may be present in Nicodemus's framework of understanding that's causing this resistance to the words of Jesus? This is where we just want to go here this week. We're going to take it a little bit deeper next week. But let's talk about the story, and let's talk about what is going on from Nicodemus's perspective that is causing the barrier of understanding of to him receiving what Jesus is trying to say. So let's do that. And I'll join Bill.
We have 3 tables.
Yeah, we can.
Well, if you can come join us.
Slide on down there. I go to the church sometimes, and nobody's ever